But in the recent years, especially teaching in a law school, I've kind of given up on environmental law. Not given up on it in the sense that I don't think it's valuable, but realizing it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to change the world. And the reason part of the reasons, well, there's a couple of reasons it's not going to change the world. And this is very similar to thinking of the medical profession, is environmental, you think about it, it's very obvious. Environmental law, to get where it wants to go, has to get laws passed. So it has to go to the government. Well, the government is the biggest developer around. I mean, you know, there's no question. I mean, it's the BC government, the federal government. So there's a big limit as to what you can get. And it's also lawyers. Like, I'm over here to talk to a conference tomorrow, like 2,000 lawyers. And just looking at the outline of this, like, how far can you go with the legal profession? And how far can you go with the medical profession? How far can you go with the state? And so I'm saying my sort of thing these days in the latter part of my career as a law professor is, well, if that's the case, how do we think about it? How do we get there? Where do we go now? What do we do instead? And so it's interesting to go ahead, you really start going back. And so what I've been doing a lot in my work is actually looking historically. You know, the great French philosopher Michel Foucault, that many of you may have heard of, was a cultural philosopher, talking about genealogies of knowledge. How do the different families of institutions and so on come to the point where we think the way we think, and we have institutions that have values and structures that work the way they work? How do we understand that? And that's why when you look at the history of medicine, or the history of almost any of these structures that so control our future, it's very difficult to get past where they're at because they're so entrenched in deep historical contexts that set the limits of how they're structured and how they can think. And that, of course, is what the naturopathic tradition, I'm sure, is dealing with. And so I just want to talk a bit about what I've been working on in going back to look at those sort of genealogies, particularly the genealogies of environmentalism. And in the social kind of theoretical realm of the last, I don't know, 30 years, there's been a huge change. And up into the sort of 70s, and Michel Foucault, as I say, is a big element of this, up into the 70s, every critical thinking was really mostly about kind of material structures, the economy, capitalism, the state, big institutions. And then really in the 70s and 80s, the sort of postmodern change comes along. People say it's not just about these hard material institutions, it's about culture. It's about how we think. And really it's about how the two of those go together. And so, for example, tomorrow I'm on this panel with these 2,000 lawyers about sustainability in a finite world is the title of this big meeting. And when you go through the booklet, you know, sustainability of the law firm, sustainability of all these things that have nothing to do with environmental sustainability. But there are some elements of it. So in a big panel like that, what I'm going to say, what I will want to talk to them about is, well, we've got it backwards. It's not how we sustain an economy by considering the environment. It's given the environmental systems we have, how do we change, what type of economy can work, right? And the big problem, and this is huge with naturopathy, I'm sure, is the big problem with my presentation tomorrow will be that we can't have a conversation about it, right? I mean, so for example, what a lot of these lawyers, and I haven't started there yet, so I'm not sure, but what a lot of these lawyers are going to be about is how do we look after First Nations and bring them into this process, or how do we have a little fine-tuning of tanker regulations so we can develop the tar sands. To me, that is the core element, which is we can't talk about it because we get shut down immediately if you say tar sands, not oil sands. You have to play that game. And even if you do try to talk about it, people really are not sufficiently trained as citizens or educated, and I don't mean this in an elite way, just that we've not been taught about how our world works from forever, from childhood on. That's a big social problem. So in my looking at this, I see three major elements that we really need to look at: the nature of the economy, the nature of our government, and what's happening with our culture. And all of these fit with, I think, with the naturopathic tradition. For example, and so another story of it demonstrates this. There's scholars come to UVic all the time to give talks, and we had one a couple of years ago, a philosophy professor, I think it's philosophy from Columbia, and he came to talk about the Enlightenment. 1600s, all throughout Europe, the Enlightenment. Well, we all, of course, in the Western tradition, think the Enlightenment's a great thing, right? The light has been turned on. We become rational. We're not submerged in superstition and in torture and all these crazy things in the medieval world. And this fellow came and he said, well, actually, you know what? That's not really right. There was a tradition in the Enlightenment, the radical Enlightenment is called, and there's talked about a book, very interesting book on it, where the argument was, well, there's actually different strands in the Enlightenment, and only one strand really succeeded. And the conservative strand, the church, and just keeping everything exactly the way it is with the church kind of controlling ideas, that didn't work so well. They lost eventually. Then there's on the other side the radical Enlightenment, which I'll get back to in a second. But the group that really won in a way was the synthesis of modern scientists, particularly in London, the Royal Society with people like Isaac Newton and Boyle and what's his name? Francis Bacon. Not Francis Bacon, that's the painter.
Kevin Bacon?
No.
Anyway. Bacon.
Huh?
It's Francis
Is it Francis Bacon?
Bacon.
Okay, Francis Bacon. Who's the painter? I'm not getting anyway. Bacon. But the scientists, the commercial interests, and the Reformed Church, right? The Anglican Church, the Church of England, and said, we need science. We need hard science because that's going to work for our business interests, basically. Develop, technologies, the technological move was happening, the discovery of the new world. So it's very much, and technologies of agriculture and so on. But the group that was displaced in this was the people, the radical Enlightenment. And they were descendants of and part of the old commons, where people lived on the land and had communal pastures and farmed their land really in a feudal system, but very independent of the commercial interests, the urban areas, and so on. Very, very traditional cultures. Well, in many ways, and very mystical cultures that had strong connection to self-reliance on the land. And when you look at that struggle, one of the reasons the radical Enlightenment was displaced, and people don't think about that anymore. The Enlightenment was just a single movement of science throwing off old tradition. When you look at how that happens, there's a very good book by Barbara Ehrenreich, a little small thing, called Witches, Midwives, Nurses is the title. Right? And her argument in that book is that here are three feminist healing traditions and how they changed. And when you look at how the Enlightenment took place, the Enlightenment took place in the 1600s after 100 years of witch burning. I don't know if any of you have read about the history of witches in Europe in the 1400s and 1500s, but it's unbelievable, and this is very naturopathic in the sense that witches were healers. They were women healers who used herbal remedies, knew the woods, knew the land, and were able to harvest those and work with people and heal them. And when you read the details of this, it's absolutely, it's impossible to understand, to appreciate the horror and the pain and how organized it was. There were manuals, published manuals on how to identify a witch and root out a witch. And there were over 100,000 witches, quote unquote witches, killed in the 1500s, and they were killed in the most horrendous of ways, tortured to within an inch of their lives, and then killed. And one of the proofs of being a witch was if your healing worked. If your herbal remedies worked, you were clearly guilty, because the only way you could know that was through the devil. Because all knowledge, scientific knowledge, was either scientific done through, well, in science, modern science was just getting going, but basically through processes approved by the church. And if you were a woman in particular, but someone who had no training and was not approved by the church, the fact of success was itself guilt, right? So when you look at that history, so there's the interrelationship between that tradition, to me, that intellectual tradition, that development of rational modernity, and in conjunction with institutions of the growth of capital and those allied with the state, that is, to me, the kind of cultural inheritance that is so deep in our world that we have to deal with, we have to change, we have to work to get past if this planet is going to survive. So for example, trying to think of a particular example of how that plays out. Well, the law. The idea of the law. So I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to a bunch of talking to lawyers tomorrow. But in those days, in that the period of the 1600s, the law was really up for grabs, because so much of legal regulation was at the community level. There were things like shires and moots that resolved local conflict at the community level with citizens. And at the same time, governments were getting going, the state was getting going. And so the idea of the common law it's an interesting history of that. The common law was created by lawyers in the central court going out, particularly, say, for example, and then going out through all the local communities and finding out what their rules were and how they're trying their process, and pulling them together and moving them to the Court of Westminster in central London, where lawyers would take over. And so not just were traditional medicines being displaced by the sciences, but legal self-regulation was being displaced by centralization of the legal process. Very similar process in North America, where, again, Indian doctors or traditional First Nations ways of running the land, looking after their communities, totally displaced by centralization of authority in Ottawa or in London, right? So the process of displacing, placing people from the land and from the knowledges of the land and the healing arts of the land and the community decision-making of the land, moving that to centralized state institutions that can make a profit as well, capitalist institutions, and changing the culture is something to be that sort of a rationalistic, scientific, centralized, urban culture is where we're coming from, and where I think naturopathic sympathies, at least, are in conflict. Witches, midwives, nurses. So moving from the illegal, the obliterated tradition of healing outside any structure at all, to, except a communal structure, and a structure where knowledges were passed down from one woman to another, and men as well. Actually, men were burned as witches as well if they did this sort of healing. It's the sort of witchcraft using remedies that were both psychological and also based in herbal remedies, but mostly women. Displacement of that and centralization of forms of knowledge. And part of it was, of course, professions, a medical profession. So moving from witches to midwives moves much more towards a, if not regulated in a modern sense, but at least institutionalized training processes of midwifery that throughout the 19th century, home births and so on was standard practice because it was too big for other than urban hospitals to handle. But then that moves into the nursing tradition, right? Where nurses work within and underneath the power of the medical establishment. Just as dispute resolution, traditional dispute resolutions become legal that are worked with underneath the legal profession. So the historical process that I find myself confronted with as an environmentalist, wanting to see very different types of ways of relating to the physical environment, require us to rethink everything. We have to rethink the nature of our resources, the way we use the physical world. So, for example, 20 years ago, I don't know, 1993, if any of you were around in 93, the big battles of Clayoquot Sound, right? And all the people being arrested trying to protect Clayoquot Sound, First Nations and environmentalists working together. One of the things that came out of Clayoquot Sound, which is under the NDP, which was in those days a very progressive outcome, was this scientific panel on Clayoquot Sound. And the idea of that panel was, how can we create a different way of living in Clayoquot Sound that works with Clayoquot Sound and allows it to survive? And so the conclusion of that was the need to create a forest economy in Clayoquot Sound where the economic processes actually are a subset of the ecological processes. So rather than saying, well, we're going to have logging in Clayoquot Sound and we have a few rules over here to prevent all the damage to streams or fish habitat or whatever, and so we'll just cut 80%, 90% of the trees and leave a few trees along stream beds, and so take out 90% of the wood, which is what happens everywhere in BC. Instead of doing that, the scientific panel said, we've got to flip it. What is necessary for the ecology of Clayoquot Sound to survive? All the details, the compositions, the structures, the different functions of this to work for everything. If you're going to have that survive, what sort of a forest industry can we have here? How much can we take out? Well, instead of being 90% of the trees, it might be 15% or 20% with very different technologies of logging. So tomorrow, when I'm going to talk about how does the environment fit with, how does the economy fit with the environment on a sustainable way, it's that type of an inversion. But you can't make that inversion without a very different economy. You can't make that inversion without a very different government. You can't make that inversion without challenging a lot of big economic interests. I don't know, as with you here, how much that resonates with your experience, but that to me is what I see, how I understand the parallels with naturopathy, in the sense that the type of knowledges that the type of knowledge tradition that regular medicine comes from is one which is very organized, very centralized, very hierarchical, very male, very oriented to single variable types of understandings where you can separate out all the other variables. There's a great book, another French philosopher, Bruno Latour, called "We Have Never Been Modern." You know, I don't know if any of you know that book. It's hard to read, but it's very wordy. But the thesis is very simple, which is to say, the nature of modernity is and this goes back to the Enlightenment again. The nature of being modern is the absolute separation of the social from the natural world. Right? That science and modernity is based upon complete separation, and the model of that is the lab. Absolutely nothing gets into the laboratory. You know, it's completely sealed, so we can isolate the single variable and just work with that single variable. And the argument of we've never been modern is, well, of course, it's futile, right? How can we ever separate the natural out and just be purely the social? And I mean, our bodies, or Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. Well, you know, crazy. I think pure mind separated from pure body. Totally ridiculous. But that's very much the tradition, the scientific tradition, I think, that dominates in all kinds of realms. And then along with that goes the economic aspect of that, big pharma, the capitalism of the pill. That unless you can translate something into a form that allows for the accumulation of capital, we're not interested. So apple cider vinegar, even if it does have long-term beneficial effects in balancing the acidic and the alkaline, you can't make a lot of money. I mean, maybe a vinegar manufacturer can, but you turn that into a pill, fine. So there's that single variable science, but also how that intersects so nicely with the economic tradition. And then again, government, right? Government regulation of the professions, so that very much organized to keep it under control of this power structure which we've inherited forever. And I mean, I have a chiropractor in Victoria. He's a fabulous chiropractor, phenomenal diagnostician. The guy's unbelievable. He's not well, he's very good. And one of the things he said to me, you try to get a chiropractic college inside a university, forget it, right? I mean, the medical profession goes crazy. Now, SFU is actually having a chiropractic school on the university grounds. They're going to put one at SFU, but it's not actually formally affiliated with SFU. It's as close as they can get. And SFU, of course, with the new president, is very much more community-oriented and progressive about these things. So, to me, that what I see, and I say, I mean, I'm not a naturopath or expert at all, although I have a sense of it, is that the problems, the challenges of naturopathy and the challenges of the environmental movement are very similar. We need people to be able to take control more of their own understanding of the world, how the structures of power work, where our knowledges come from, how our bodies are affected by the way we live. I mean, it's stunning to me that, I'm reading the business section. When you put your book down and flip to the newspaper, you immediately find some new statement about sugar's bad for this is the big new thing this week. It was not new, but all these articles on sugar, and you see it day after day, week after week in the sections of the newspaper. To me, it seems to make no difference. Like, all this information is out there, and there's an elite group, mostly upper middle class people, who sort of pay attention to it. But in terms of the mass structure of our societies, we don't really pay attention to these things. And it's because, why? Because turn the page, and there's a full page ad on some, grocery store that's saying, discount on Fruit Loops and all these terrible things which are really bad for you. So we get all these we get these conflicting messages, and it's very hard for us to develop that understanding of where we're coming from and where we have